Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Planning for 2023 to Plan for the Unexpected. My name is Willem van der Veld, and I'm one of the Global Key Account Managers here at Flexport. It's an honor to be here and present this theme, which is actually very important also for my clients as well. I will be presenting this webinar together with my colleagues, Timmy and Chris, who will introduce themselves in a bit. Before we begin, we just need to cover a few housekeeping items. So on your screen, you will see a sidebar in the right of the main stage. If you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located in the sidebar. On the top of your screen, you will find the slides we present and the upcoming webinar on the 25th of October. You can ask questions through the Q&A tab throughout the webinar. Your questions will only be visible to you and our Flexport team. We will do our best to answer as many questions as time allows, and we will have also time at the end to address these questions. An on-demand version of this webinar will also be available shortly after the webinar concludes and can be accessed using the same link you're using right now. And by the way, we've also shared a link to this presentation in the chat right now. So I believe you could see it if you can see it. Yeah. Considering the topic of today, I believe that is actually important to mention, but we can actually move to the next slide, please. Is a legal note. It's quite well tied to the topic we're discussing today, but please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Well, I mean, that was to keep our legal team happy, obviously, but this also ties in well with my introduction part. But first, let's just do a quick round of introductions. Chris, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Rogers. I'm the Principal Supply Chain Economist here at Flexport. My job is to help you understand the economic world, how that plays into supply chains, and how that plays into trade. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the baseline scenarios you might want to be thinking about for next year.
Thank you, Chris. Timmy?
Yes, thank you very much, Willem, and hello, everybody. I'm Timmy. I lead the sales team in Flexport in Scandinavia, and when it is my turn to talk today, I'll make a short case for scenario planning, and I'll also do my best to give everybody here some inspiration to build their own probable futures, and we'll learn what that looks like in a little while.
Thank you, Timmy. And now, moving on to the topics we're going to cover today. So the topic of the webinar is planning for 2023. Now, we're going to address how are we going to address this topic? First, Chris will talk about as he mentioned, the macroeconomic situation and potential scenarios based on past data and available information about what's coming. And then secondly, I will briefly talk about the ocean and air markets and what factors we believe will have the most impact on each. And then Timmy will be talking about scenario building based on probable futures. Finally, and as a recap, we will give some tools which could potentially be used for your planning. But before handing over to Chris, I want to highlight here that we are going to cover quite some topics today at a high level, where actually on each of these topics, you could spend a full session talking about them. So we are going to take a broad approach to this, meaning this webinar will not be focused specifically to one industry or product. But finally, the aim of the webinar is to create awareness about some scenarios we foresee might happen in 23 and give you some ideas on how to approach your planning strategy. In the end, I do want to encourage you that in case you have some questions still open about this specific topic, or you would like to further deep dive into what it would mean for your business, that you reach out to either to us, to one of three of us, or to your Flexport contact to schedule a separate session to cover that. All right, over to you, Chris.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Willem. So you're going to have to brace yourselves, I'm afraid. There's some not great news coming up. In general terms, when we're looking at building an outlook, one should be thinking about not just where you're going, but where you're starting from. It's a bit like trying to use Google Maps or Apple Maps. You need to know where you're starting off, and the current economic situation is frankly put pretty dark, and that's likely to inform a lot of people's scenarios going into next year. What you're seeing here on this first chart is inflation. The left-hand chart is input producer price inflation. So these are the costs faced by manufacturers and retailers as they purchase their products and go through their production process. And you can see here that there's been a marked ramp up. The purple line on here is the producer price inflation for the euro area that's already broken through 45% year over year. Now, a large part of that is due to the commodity markets, particularly energy. Everybody buys energy in some form, whether it's the electricity for your house or the natural gas used for heating, the metals used in production, and even the food that we put on our tables. And all of these have become more expensive over the past year, in part due to the conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia being really at the baseline of a lot of those commodity supply chains. So that's been driving up there. In the UK and the US, we've actually seen a bit of a dip down, and that's partly because oil prices came down for a little while, and there is some uncertainty around that at the moment. Those higher producer prices have fed into consumer prices, so the prices that you and I face when we go to the shops every day or when we get the bills from our utility provider and so on. Again, the euro area is the highest of the three economies shown here, with data coming out today showing it hitting 10%. The US and the UK somewhat lower. Again, that's partly due to a lower exposure to the natural gas prices that are coming particularly from Russia, and the other countries having seen a slightly higher proportion of oil, and that comes through gasoline, petrol, diesel, and so on. So inflation is still very high, and it's higher than most people have really seen, certainly during their professional lifetimes. Obviously, I've got more grey hair than my colleagues, so I've been around a little bit longer. But these inflation rates are unlike anything we've seen since the early 1990s. As a consequence of which, that's really had a very negative impact on consumer confidence. Consumer confidence in the left-hand side, the purple line is effectively how consumers are feeling about the state of the economy in a survey carried out by the European Commission. And the most recent result there in August was its worst since the survey started in the mid-1980s. So it's important not to understate how depressed consumers are at the moment. After all, we are all consumers. The right-hand chart is showing the US. The US is a little bit more upbeat, or has become a little bit more upbeat recently. It is a very volatile series. But I would say, again, that's partly tied to the state of gasoline prices. So as you can see from these first two slides, you do, when you're thinking about where you are and where you're going, really need to have an eye to where commodity markets are going, because that feeds into a lot of these other areas. I think another area that inflation has driven, of course, is monetary policy. So the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the US Federal Reserve, the PBOC in China have all been looking at their interest rate policies. And certainly for the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, they've been pushing up those interest rates. That's designed to try and slow the economy, slow inflation. And obviously that's going to have an impact on people's spending power. So again, you need to be thinking through what the potential state of different government policies, and I'll mention that again a little bit later on. Now, depressed consumers haven't yet stopped spending, but there has been a downturn. So these two charts are showing you retail store sales and non-store sales. So non-store is e-commerce, how those have changed year over year. And you can see in the most recent data for August that the EU, the UK, and the US are all seeing retail store sales fall year over year when adjusted for inflation. So taking inflation out. So you can think of that as being the volume of stuff that people are buying. And we've really seen a fall, not just in kind of the volatile areas like food and fuel, but really across the board. But it's worth bearing in mind that we've seen sales come down a bit, but not a lot. And in fact, most of these sales are still 10% above 2019 levels in real terms. There's also been a drop in non-store sales in e-commerce in Europe. That's partly because we had a big return to, we had a big level of online shopping last year when we were still in the teeth of the pandemic, whereas now people have started going back to stores. So there's a little bit of a mismatch in behaviours there. But suffice it to say, retail spending has started to come down. Now, that's partly had an impact on business confidence, but businesses are becoming less confident more broadly. The left-hand chart shows you business confidence in future conditions, economic conditions, in a survey gathered by the OECD. And you can see there the purple line, which is the UK, and the black line, which is the Euro area, have really seen a marked decline in business confidence over the past few months. We're not yet, however, below 100. Below 100 is a situation where companies are assuming there'll be an economic contraction, so a shrinking of the economy. And that's the point at which projects get cancelled, employment starts to be reduced, and we start to see these kind of later economic cycle impacts. And I would be very careful if you're relying on business spending for your order book. Do think very carefully about what might happen in the state if we end up in a recession. The other point to bear in mind is that corporate inventories are already very high. And if we look at some of the specifics in the right-hand chart, the black bar is the state of inventories in the second quarter of 2022. The purple bar is where that same number was on average in 2011 to 2019. And you can see for many of the sectors, the black bar is above the purple bar, which means inventories versus sales are much higher than they've been in the past. And that's normally a sign that either companies have bought too much, or that they're trying to preempt inflation, or that they're trying to avoid future shortages. And we've written extensively on this topic. I think if you look at some of those bars, the first one on the left is household durables. So that's furniture. It includes consumer electronics and home appliances in there. We've already got very high levels of inventories versus the past. And to a certain extent, we've seen companies talking about wanting to preempt inflation. So if you buy it now, you can buy it for less and you buy it in the future, as well as to a certain extent trying to prevent a repeat of shortages that have been seen in the past. When you look at some of the other areas, leisure products includes toys, where we've seen a lot of the toy makers say specifically they want to early ship this year ahead of the Christmas season. And capital goods, where we've seen companies talking about inflation, we are seeing higher inventory levels. Not everywhere is seeing that factor. The e-commerce type stores have actually got lower inventories than they've had in the past, and that partly reflects an increase in their levels of efficiency over time. The question, that's kind of where we are, pretty dark place. The question is, like, where are we going next? And I think, before I kind of opine on what you should be looking at, I'd like to kind of hear what you think. So a quick audience poll for you, and you should have a little polling thing pop up on your screen. So take a second to answer, please. How long do you think it will take before the economy recovers? Are you an optimist, and so you expect that to happen in early 2023? Are you not so hopeful? It might take a little bit longer, perhaps into 2023. Are you convinced that, like, it's all doom, it's all gloom, it's going to take forever, we're heading to 2024? Or did you turn up to this webinar not really knowing, and you need more help on that? So please take a second to vote. I think in the early voting, it looks like nobody's feeling good about the early part of next year. Looks like a pretty even split between the doomsters and those who are not so hopeful but not overly worried. All right, well, look, we'll close the vote. Thank you very much for your votes there. So, it looks like nobody's really expecting a recovery, much before the middle of next year and possibly later. So, let's take a look at what some experts are saying. So on the next slide, we've recently had new forecasts put out there by the multilateral agencies, including the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank are due soon. From a more supply chain perspective, though, we're interested in trade activity. The WTO, the World Trade Organization's trade outlook for next year is they expect growth to continue to slow. The left-hand chart is showing you their the history for 2021 and their projections for 2022 and 2023. And you can see there, for many regions, the purple bar is lower than the black bar, which is showing you a continued slowdown. And for North America and Europe, growth in trade is expected to be only around 1% year over year next year. The right-hand chart is showing you their forecast revisions. And what we can see there is that they've really quite aggressively marked down their figures for next year. And a large part of that is really reflecting concerns about the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine and the disruptive effects that's having. They've also said in their documentation they're concerned about tighter monetary policy. That may squeeze the economy. That in turn may squeeze trade. But do head over to the WTO website and take a look at their report and their numbers. It can provide a really useful baseline for your scenario analyses. I think the other topic it's worth looking at is thinking about not just will there be a recovery, but how will we get to a recovery and how long will it take? I think in that regard, forecasting is really difficult, but there are at least three options you can potentially look at. One is a V-shaped recovery, so a sudden rebound. That would require, I think, a rapid end to the conflict, central banks to reduce interest rates quite quickly. And I think looking at that poll from earlier on, it looks like not many of you are a believer in that kind of scenario. Another scenario is more moderate. You can imagine a banana-shaped or a U-shape where it takes several months or even several quarters to begin to see a recovery come through. That feels pretty much common with the general view that you guys were giving in the poll, and it's also pretty consistent with what the WTO and the IMF are saying as well. The best you could probably hope for is just a growth slowdown, so no recession, escape from all of that. That, frankly put, is a relatively low likelihood at this stage, according to most of the multilateral agencies. But one could still be hopeful. Now, I think when you're going about building scenarios, not only do you need to take a general view on how long recovery will take, you also need to have a think about what's going to be happening to your business in the meantime. This slide shows the drop in consumption from peak to trough in all the recessions in the US going back to 1990. So companies with a long bar are those that tend to suffer during a recession. Those with a short bar are ones that tend to do relatively better during a recession. There's an important point to note here that some of these bars are showing a drop of, on average, around 25% in total consumer spending in their industry from peak to trough. Some are much higher. In terms of the colors, the blue bars are electronics. If you're working in that industry, then recession could be pretty tough. The green lines are showing you home appliances, household goods, and so on. Quite a bit of variation there. Stuff related to decorating, funnily enough, so home lighting and home textiles tends to be more exposed than some of those bigger ticket items. And then the red bars are apparel or clothing. Funnily enough, male type apparel tends to drop less during a recession than female type apparel. I don't want to read too much into that, but it does really underscore the point that it's the details of your business that can vary quite significantly during a recession. So how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing is you've got to go fishing for the institutional knowledge within your firm. Look for people who've been through more than one recession and learn a lot about how that process went. I'd also say when you're building your analysis, you want to start simple, iterate it, and then build your forecast and review it steadily over time. As we've discussed already, there's a lot of moving parts in terms of data that you should be looking at. Oops, sorry. In terms of those uncertainties, there are a lot of different areas to think about. Will the conflict in Ukraine continue? Are there going to be risks of a conflict in the South China Sea? Politics is always very uncertain. We're already seeing governments beginning to intervene in energy markets. They're starting to cut taxes. And then, of course, we've got all the uncertainties around how logistics networks are operating. And when it comes to logistics, we've got experts that can talk to you about that. One of those experts is Willem. So with this, I'll hand over to him.
Thank you, Chris. So, doom scenario upcoming for 2023. I was not expecting that one, but yeah, it makes a little sense. Well, thank you for sharing all that. So now Chris has given a good review about the macroeconomic situation, and I will now do a quick run through the air and ocean markets and what we foresee to impact the situation in 2023. So moving on to the first slide. So in the air market, one of the most commonly used indicators to review its status is the capacity development, right? So on the left-hand chart, it shows the demand for capacity in black and the actual available capacity in blue versus 2019. So we can see that in the initial pandemic drop in both has yet to be recovered. So the available capacity has actually gotten worse during 2022. The right-hand chart shows capacity utilization rate for global air freight. So elevated load factors seen in 2020 and 2021, which are the dark gray and the black bars, by the way, have now reverted to near to pre-pandemic levels. So what does this tell us? Well, this shows that the capacity is recovering to the level before the pandemic. Now that also ties into the economical situation, right? But it's also easing off the pressure that we're feeling there on the capacity levels. And this is resulting also in a drop in rates over the last few months. Now, moving to the next slide, we will review some of the factors impacting the air market, which we believe will impact the market. So, starting with capacity, we strongly believe that the market conditions will continue to move towards the pre-pandemic levels, meaning capacity will improve further and stabilize. Now, looking at some specific trade lanes, we are seeing some overcapacity on the Europe to US, so the transatlantic flow, and this is all not likely to change much in 23. So there's an overcapacity over there. On the other hand, on the Far East westbound, so from Asia to Europe, the capacity is still under pressure, even though the levels are much reduced compared to last year. But it's under pressure with about 13% lower global freighter capacity when comparing Q3 22 versus Q3 21. So 13% lower global freighter capacity. And that is mainly still due to the consequences of the war in the Ukraine, even though improvements have been implemented, but the levels are still not like before. So, so we believe that the pressure will remain higher on this very popular trade lane, the Far East westbound, during 23. But obviously, this also depends on many other factors. So the air market, just like the ocean market, what we will see in a bit, will also be impacted by local disruptions. And here, namely, the personnel and equipment shortages will play a role. For example, the tracking capacity in Europe is strongly under pressure. You might have seen it already yourselves, but we also see higher delays happening due to tracking not being available in time for picking up the goods arriving in Europe. But we obviously also fear the zero tolerance for COVID in China, which will impact the air situation, especially for Shanghai or the cross-border situation in Hong Kong, but also delays due to pilot availability. With regards to political disruptions, we are especially looking at the situation around Taiwan, but this will obviously have huge impact not only for air. And now, quickly looking at the rate outlook, we continue to see an increased move from air to ocean. And this is something that we see happening with the different clients, either in fashion, but also in consumer durables like kitchen appliances, for example. So for the first half of 23, we foresee the rates to drop again and getting closer to pre-pandemic levels. For the second half, however, and this is a little bit getting out of that doom scenario, obviously, that was just mentioned in the poll as well. So we're hoping for that U-shape scenario to kick in the second half, but where improved economies can lead to higher demand. But all in all, our expectation is that the rates will normalize, but will normalize to a level which is higher than pre-COVID due to the higher fuel costs and the focus on profitability by the airlines. All right, now moving on to the ocean market. So just like we did for the air market, we're now first going to look how the situation is right now. So there are two good indicators for the ocean market. that you see in this combined graph about the Asia to Europe flow. This chart compares the ocean timeliness indicator, so this is the black line, referring to the amount of days between cargo ready up to destination port departure. So I will repeat that because it can be a bit complex, but it's referring to the so the black line refers to the amount of days between cargo ready up to destination port departure. And the blue line shows the container shipping rates. So what you see here is an elevation from about 60 days before the pandemic to a peak of 120 days in spring 22. This has since reverted to around 90 days, still well above pre-pandemic levels. But what this means is that rates are actually dropping heavily, meaning especially in the last few months, week over week, we see the rates dropping, meaning that there's sufficient capacity available. However, the end-to-end operations are not recovering as quickly. So in this case, it can be, for example, due to strikes in the UK, which we've seen in Felixstowe in the UK, but also congestions in Germany, also due to a lack of truck availability, or local disruptions at origin, such as typhoons or lockdowns. But in the end, it looks like we're moving to pre-pandemic levels, just like in the ARP. So now let's have a look to the next slide to what we believe will impact 23. So one of the most discussed topics in the ocean market is the IMO 23, and I think we cannot leave it undiscussed. So this for the ones that do not know, but IMO 23 targets vessel efficiency and carbon intensity to reduce total emissions by at least 40% from 2008 level up to 2030. So with 40% less. So now what can be expected from this? So one point is that carriers might choose to lower the speed of the older vessels in order to lower the emissions, right? But this will then logically lead to higher lead times and finally having a negative impact on the overall capacity. So in order for carriers to meet these goals, additional capacity is needed with newer and more efficient vessels. So the CEO of Maersk actually lately mentioned that he expects a need for additional capacity of between 5 and 15% to meet these targets. So, however, we also understood that penalties are not expected to be implemented as of January 23. So that's an interesting point, right? So we are still unsure how the impact will be early 23. So it all depends how that will develop. On the other hand, we see that new vessels are being deployed, meaning that the total fleet growth which could result in a total fleet growth of about 10% from now up to 2025. So it's a 10% increase from now to 25. But this might not cover the full impact of IMO, unfortunately. On the disruption side, we see some overlap with the air market, obviously, with the same shortages and COVID-19. But we also highlight an additional one, which is the social unrest. This can also impact the air market for sure. However, now for ocean, it's very actual due to the situation in Felixstowe, UK, which is highly impacting the northern European side of the operations. On the rate side, we expect the rates to further decrease in the first half, mainly due to the low demand caused by the weak economies, but also strong competition between ocean carriers. But most importantly, several carriers have lately announced global blank sailing programs, which will have a huge effect on overall operations. And this is primarily due to the dramatic decrease in bookings and to slow down the erosion of the rates. For the second half of 23, just like in the air market, we expect the economy, well, hoping, because everybody is not, or most of you are actually aiming for a doom scenario, or actually expecting a doom scenario, let's say. But if we take the scenario of the U shape again, described by Chris, where the economy improves, we hope to see that demand will pick up and the inventory levels will go down here in Europe. around the globe, actually. Now, over to Timmy, who will talk about supply chain planning in these uncertain times.
Thank you very much, Willem. And what we'll do now is try to answer the question, so what to do with all of this great information we've been presented with. Next slide, please. And here I'd like to start by bringing the Danish physicist Niels Bohr on stage, because he's famously quoted for saying that prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And it doesn't take a Nobel Prize laureate to know that Niels was, of course, right. And because predicting the future is so difficult, we tend to plan for the averages. And that has worked well for many years in the industry because the market and global supply chains have been stable enough to allow us the luxury of the average approach. But average does not work when ships get stuck in the Suez Canal or when lockdowns make it impossible to ship out of or into the ports we normally use. Looking at the next slide, we see that if a supply chain leader had based her 2020 freight spend budget on the average of 2019, she would have gotten away with it, probably. But just imagine what kind of questions she would have been asked by her management if the 2021 budget had been based on the average of 2020. So when averages don't work, the big question that supply chain professionals and business leaders have started to ask themselves earlier this year is this. Next slide, please. How do we move on from the extreme events and market turmoil and build a supply chain that is resilient against shocks? Before we answer, let's first try to understand what we mean by resilience in this context. Resilience is not predicting neither the average nor the single correct future and then preparing for that. Instead, resilience is acting in ways that make sense across a range of probable futures. So how exactly do we do that? Here, the answer lies in the ability to harness key signals in the market. And what does that mean, to harness key signals? It means that as supply chain professionals, we need to seek out better data, better research, and more accurate information about the world around us. Exactly like you're all doing right now by participating in this webinar, so good for you all. And then we also need to do a couple of more things. First, we should turn all of that information into the probable future scenarios. And then we try to figure out what actions, what behaviors make sense across those scenarios we put together. So let's now go step by step and first take a look at some of the possible market conditions we might find ourselves in during the next 18 months. And after that, we'll round off with a couple of practical actions that make sense to deploy considering these different scenarios. And let's start with an action that always makes sense in our industry, and that is frequent revisions of your analysis. On the next slide, you see that 3 months ago in July of this year, at Flexport, we were looking at 4 scenarios and their corresponding probabilities. They look like this. The first scenario was a rapid recovery of rates and operational standards to pre-COVID levels already by the end of this year. And for that to materialize, we believed that 3 things needed to happen. First, that the entire industry collaborated to address bottlenecks and unlock capacity everywhere in the system. Secondly, demand had to return to pre-pandemic levels. And thirdly, no more external shocks. And we gave that scenario a low probability in July. The second scenario we considered was a more gradual recovery. In this scenario, rates would slowly decrease and bottom out towards the third quarter next year. And the main drivers for this future would be in the introduction of new ships to the market and a stagnant demand. And this scenario we gave a high probability. And finally, we considered two scenarios that would have us all struggle with high rates and continued tough capacity constraints through 2024. As you can imagine, we've had to revise the probabilities of those scenarios very recently. And the next slide will show our most recent probability assessment. We now assign a high probability to the first scenario with rapid recovery of rates and operational standards by the end of this year. And we do that because demand is getting close to pre-pandemic levels. And to Chris's data point earlier, inventory to sales ratios are the highest in a decade. This means that much fewer new purchase orders are being placed with factories in Asia. Less containers are therefore being booked, and ocean capacity is now abundant. And we see the results in the rates, where the latest Shanghai index rate is below $3,000 per 20 foot, down from almost $6,000 in July, where we first made our analysis. And because we haven't seen any meaningful external shocks to the global supply chain, bottlenecks are easing up, and we can see that in the transit time discussed earlier, where expected transit time from Asia to Europe is down 90 days from previous 120 days. And at the opposite end of the range, we no longer consider it a probable scenario that the market will not recover. So these scenarios were an example of an analysis that makes sense to build. What you've seen here is what makes sense from the perspective that Flexport has. And what is important is that you practice building out these analyses in your own context. And we've looked at new macro data, we've looked at fresh market information, and we've taken that and turned it into these future scenarios. And that's actually the first steps in building out a more resilient supply chain for 2023. If you look at the next slides, where we're going to talk about strategies to prepare, and next one as well, Chris, with the purpose of figuring out how to stay in control in an uncertain environment. I'll hand it back now to Chris, who will summarize how to go about building scenarios. And after that, Willem and I will give you a few suggestions for actions that make sense to consider deploying once you've built your own probable future. Next slide there, please, and back over to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much, Timmy. Yeah, so as it's been mentioned already, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about the future. I've already mentioned from an economic perspective, you've got those different concepts of a V-shaped recovery, which will be very rapid, a U or banana-shaped recovery, which will take some time, which seems to resonate with a lot of people on this call. But I think if you're going about building it, there's a few practical points as well. I think the first thing is you need data, right? You just can't go with your opinion of, well, I think it's going to be. It's got to be based in data. We've shown you a lot of data today. Obviously, there's a lot more out there. And if you head over to flexport.com/research, you'll see the kind of data points that we look at and the indicators that we use when we're trying to assess the state of the economy. As Timmy referred to as well, you can't fire and forget. Like when you're building your economic model, you need to review it on a frequent basis. A lot of economic stats come out on a monthly basis, whether that's retail sales figures, whether it's inflation data, whether it's international trade data. These things are all updated on a very frequent basis, and you should certainly be tracking that. So if something tracks outside of your core scenario, you can very rapidly come back to it. It's also important, though, to not try and boil the ocean. Don't try and build like the one model to rule them all that has every element of the global economy. And think about what matters for your business, what the main inputs are, and think about those first, and then build out from that. You can always iterate around a model. It can be quite daunting as a small company looking at all of this data and go, how the hell do I even start with it? So start simple and then iterate, and you'll very rapidly find what works for you. And just to kind of reiterate that point as well about the use of data, you've got external data points that are out there. And as I mentioned, our research website has plenty for you to look at there. But you also have your own internal data as well. So make sure that you're tying that in. And obviously, part of the Flexport offering can help you better understand your own data, whether it's in terms of your shipping or your customs and so on. But that's a whole advertorial for another day. Timmy, Willem, do you want to talk a bit about designing strategies and communicating them?
Yeah, Chris, thanks. So one action that makes sense to consider is your procurement strategy. In a down market like the one we have now, the thinking goes that you shouldn't tender your business because you will most likely have access to cheaper rates next month or the next quarter. And while that is true, an RFP, a request for proposal, is not only about rates. At least it doesn't have to be. It could also be a great opportunity to learn more about other aspects of the freight forwarder's service offerings. Just ask for a short rate validity and then spend much more time asking the forwarders or the carriers about data security. How will they protect themselves against a cyber attack? What are some of the technological developments that they're working on? And how are they able to help you become more resilient for the future? It might also be worthwhile considering to have a multi-carrier strategy, meaning asking the forwarder or forwarders, if you're working with more, to base their operations on a range of shipping lines, so that you'll always have options during times of blank sailings, which is typically around the season we're in now. A couple of other actions you might consider could be to split up your total portfolio of business into different commercial contracts. Say that you want to take advantage of the down market, but you still want to have the security of fixed space if it suddenly turns again. Figure out by doing a SKU analysis of your products, which ones are the most important, and then buy fixed space at a slightly higher rate for those items, and then go into the market with the rest of your volume. A lot of other potential actions there to stay agile, and they will of course all depend on the context of your own industry. And then finally, Willem is going to talk about the importance of communication in these very uncertain times.
Yeah, thank you, Timmy. Yeah, so in the end, when these strategies and this planning all has been done, it's what we believe it's highly very important is then also to communicate this plan and these strategies to your stakeholders, and not only internally, so by aligning with your sales teams or with management, for example, but really also to align with the suppliers and the buyers at all levels. In this way, what we see is that in this way, with having a good communication stream and alignment on all these strategies, is that also the suppliers, the third-party suppliers, can be ready to act in case they see something happening. Obviously, always in accordance to the strategy outlined by yourself. So, and this we believe that this can be very helpful. Another thing is not to forget is obviously what Chris mentioned is you're constantly also reevaluating your strategies, right? Based on the data that is evolving, based on the insights that are coming in, the development of the economy, whatever. So ensure therefore an alignment with all the parties once a planning has been adjusted. So I believe this actually brings us to an end. I'm sure there might be quite a lot of topics that you would like to further deep dive. So, as again, just coming back to one of the points that I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the webinar, is that if you have still have some topics that you further would like to deep dive or that you still would like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us or your Flexport contact to further discuss. Now we have some time left for the Q&A for some questions. So we've received a couple of questions, and one of them is actually an interesting one. You've talked a lot about downside risks. What should we be looking for on the positive side? Chris, would you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks. I've become known internally as kind of Doctor Doom, so it's a good challenge for me. I would say, the big one is clearly around the conflict in Ukraine. The sooner that comes to an end, the better. Obviously for the people of Ukraine and across Europe and globally, but for the economy more broadly as well. It removes the pressures that we've seen on a lot of commodity prices, and as I mentioned at the beginning, those commodity price pressures have driven a lot of the challenges and the downturn that we've seen at the moment. I think another area would be to keep a close eye on potential government policies, particularly around reflation. Now, there's a difficult balance here. If you've got inflation on the one hand and you give people money on the other, you might just drive more inflation. But I think the potential for governments to step in, as they did early in the pandemic, to try and support incomes could be an area that ensures that we don't get as deep a recession as we might otherwise do. There's a lot of moving parts within there, unfortunately, so that's certainly not that easy. I think a third area, and it again is linked to politics, is around finding solutions to disagreements there are with other countries that have got a lot of commodity production, and I'm thinking there particularly a new nuclear agreement with Iran, and potentially the US reaching some sort of rapprochement with Venezuela. Those would both free up more oil supplies, and again, that would feed into the commodity price stack. So in very general terms, I would say, anything that helps cushion consumers in the form of increased commodity supplies or government support could be positive, but of course, it all will depend in turn on what all of that feeds into in terms of inflation.
And if I can add something here, Chris, from a sales perspective and from a procurement perspective, to be just very concrete and practical, one of the biggest upsides of the current situation is that now is the time to really buy cheap. We've been in a situation for the last couple of years where freight rates have gone through the roof. Now they're coming back down. So be very, very, I would even go as far and say opportunistic, and make sure to constantly ask your freight forwarders, your carriers, to keep their rates in line with the market. There's a lot of money to be saved at the moment. So that's definitely an upside to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, and actually just to bounce off of that, we are beginning to see, I showed the data earlier, with very high inventory to sales ratios, particularly for some of the what we call durable or long-term goods retailers. We are starting to see retailers begin to discount their products. That's clearly not great if you're a retailer and you're having to sell stuff cheaply, but that can take some of the heat out of inflation more broadly. So, if companies can do that and maintain their profit levels, then that's something that could, kind of help again cushion the downside. Still not the upside. I need to work on my positivity.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Moving to the next question. So, will the wave of new container ships mean there's a risk of oversupply next year? So I can start on that one, and then perhaps one of you can add something there. But so there is indeed there will indeed be new vessels being deployed, and are already starting to be deployed this year, but it will also be for the next coming years. Up to 2020, I believe I mentioned it was around 10% less on increase in terms of capacity. Now, will this mean there's a risk of oversupply? It's in a way it can happen. On the other hand, we also have IMO 23 happening. So that will also have a huge impact on or expected to have a huge impact on the overall capacity, where this IMO 23 will kick in as immediately as of next year. Therefore, the vessels that are older will need to be traveling with lesser speed in order to lower the emissions. So that also reduces the capacity on one hand, and also to requote again what the CEO of Maersk mentioned, that there's a need for an additional 5 to 15% capacity in order to comply to the IMO 23. So I don't believe that there will be a huge risk of overcapacity next year due to these new vessels. I don't know, Timmy. Do you perhaps have anything to add, or Chris?
Yeah, so from my perspective, again, this is not so much a risk from a procurement perspective.
True.
This is an opportunity that
Yeah.
if there is oversupply, then it's going to be possible to procure cheaper than what we've been used to. It's not entirely good for the industry, and so it's always a little bit of a trade-off how you want to act in that environment. I can definitely understand if looking out for the cheaper rates is the priority number one.
Also perhaps good to mention is that also the carriers, the shipping carriers, shipping lines are not really happy to go back to the pre-pandemic levels where they're making loss. So, and that's also one of the reasons why the blank sailings programs have been announced, right? To keep that pressure a little bit higher and to keep that profitability levels. They have been losing so much money in the past few years. So now, yeah. So by reducing even further, I think that will be downgrading themselves as well. So I'm sure that will be play out. Chris, do you have anything there?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is it's not just about the boats going onto the water; it's the boats coming off the water. There's always the opportunity for scrapping of old vessels. A lot of the container lines have talked about how their new vessels are greener because they're using LNG or methanol. Um, and that tendency towards bigger ships that are kind of more efficient, at least on the water, even though they're more difficult to unload. We might therefore see some of the older capacity be taken off the market. And I think if steel prices go up as well, which would be part of a recovery scenario, that could also lead the shipping lines, shipping owners, to say, actually, these older boats, they're not environmentally friendly. We probably don't need them. It's time for them to be scrapped. So yeah, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on the scrapping numbers as well.
Yeah, thanks. Good point. All right, moving on to the next question. Let me just, given the three scenarios of economic recovery, have your clients talked about postponing their RFQs to see how things shake out? Timmy, do you want to take this one?
Yes, and that's actually a very good question. And yes, we're seeing a lot of customers and companies that we speak to having these thoughts about postponing the RFQ, and that makes total sense. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, here the thinking goes that we need to postpone because we would be able to get cheaper rates anyway in a month or so. And again, that's totally right. And there's also a lot of value in actually performing an RFQ if you're very deliberate about what you want to get out of it. And rates certainly are one thing, and then there's a lot of other things to consider when you do an RFQ. Is it because you want to learn more about the markets? Do you want to learn more about new players? Do you simply want to get input of on how to design your supply chain in the future? Then doing an RFQ could still be a very healthy exercise. So personally, I would still recommend to conduct an RFQ. Maybe not an RFQ, but an RFP, where proposal is a little bit a wider term than RFQ, request for quotation. But asking for a proposal might make a lot of sense if you're not entirely sure how to go about the current situation.
Thank you. Chris, anything to add there?
No, I mean, we have conversations with our customers all the time about their outlook. What I would say is that it's not just a matter of economic recovery. It's also what can I do from a practical perspective, whether that is the whole RFP process or actually discussing, am I sourcing cheaply? Do I take this kind of opportunity of a downturn to go squeeze my suppliers and say, actually, I might want to source from somewhere else and get the best pricing that I can. And that speaks that issue we were talking about earlier about talking about procurement. It's not just the ocean freight, it's kind of the full set of services and goods that companies purchase.
I think I see here a question which actually might tie a little bit into this particular discussion is, what do you think about oh sorry, no, I lost it. but what do you think about long-term pricing agreements? Where do I see it now? I lost it.
Yeah, so the
Above.
question is, well, what do you think about long-term contracts
Hey.
signed
Oh,
beginning
there it is. Yeah.
of
Okay.
this
Thanks.
year? And if we can just pick up on that, my assumption here is that the person asking is asking, are they going to stick? And that's a very good question. If you have made a long-term contract earlier this year, very likely the current spot market rates are lower than what you have contracted at the beginning of the year. So what we've seen over the last 9, 12 months is a term called enforceable contracts, which is very important here because historically in our industry, agreements and contracts were not really legally binding. They were more agreements to ship or pay what we agree over over the table in the meeting room, but there's no legal clauses to really enforce it. But a lot of the contracts that were signed earlier this year are actually enforceable contracts. Now, whether those are going to be upheld and really put to the test, personally, I'm not sure, because there are a lot of rumblings in the market that for commercial reasons, it might make sense for all parties to start negotiating again, even though the contracts were made. But from a legal perspective, I would expect most of the long-term contracts made earlier this year to actually stick.
Thanks, Simi. Um, Chris, I have a question here, which is actually also a question that I could have. But how will Europe recover if oil and gas price stay higher than what Europe used to buy it from Russia? It is now 4 times higher than before.
Yeah, people can learn to live with difficult situations for sure. What I would say is that we are seeing a lot of alternative sources of natural gas coming into Europe now, and we've got a little bit of a lesson here from the oil price, right? So in the immediate start of the conflict, the oil price shot up, and everyone's like, okay, Russian oil is off the market. That's it. It's done. The oil market can move. It's 100 million barrels a day of demand. OPEC will say there's 1 million barrels extra coming. That's 1%, and the price moves by $5 or $10 or whatever. So from $85 to $95. So it's a very reactive market. Now, when it became clear that other countries outside of the G7, so the rich countries, the European Union, the US, and so on, when it turned out that China and India and others were still willing to buy Russian oil, what effectively happened is that the market split in two. So you ended up with the Russia buyers and the not Russia buyers, and that led the oil price to drift down from its peaks over $120 a barrel back down to $85 a barrel. And it's been a pretty volatile thing over time. But suffice it to say, that shows that markets can adapt, and that's what we're seeing in natural gas now. Is we're seeing floating liquefied natural gas terminals being shipped up to the ports in the Netherlands, and we're seeing more natural gas come from the United States and elsewhere in the world. So again, we're seeing that gas market start to bifurcate away from some people who are still happy to buy Russian gas, others who are not happy to buy Russian gas. And for sure, it's painful for consumers. I think there's a side point here, though, that energy has been too cheap for too long. And that's why a lot of the environmental programs that governments have tried to push through, like the move to renewables, have taken so long because, energy's cheap. What's the point of moving to this more expensive solution? So I think, yes, we need to see energy prices come down for there to be a firm recovery. And part of that will involve effectively the market finding alternative ways to make those supplies.
I actually see here another question, which also ties into this one. Should we expect more green solutions across logistics companies to offer more competitive prices to run away from high prices of gas and gasoline? Like, for example, investment in electric vehicles. Timmy, do you want to?
Yeah, it's actually a very insightful question, and there's actually a lot of angles to answer this specific question from. At least until now, what we've seen is that the driver towards more green solutions has not really been the price of those solutions. It's more been on the ESG agenda, the sustainability, and from that perspective, yes, we do see a lot more green solutions coming up. We're talking to companies who tell us very directly that if we can find a way to arrange 100% green supply chain solution, meaning a vessel or a train or an airplane, whatever it might be that runs on electricity, they would be willing to pay a lot for that. And I'm pretty sure that's going to come in the future. To bridge the gap, though, there are other solutions in the making, some of them already in the market right now. For example, it's possible to buy green fuel for a polluting vessel, meaning, let's say you ship one container from Asia to Europe, we can calculate for you how much fuel that container is going to burn. And then we put very green fuel into the vessel. We buy fuel for that specific container into the vessel and mix it up with the polluting bunker so that that specific container is green. So some of those solutions are coming up, but as I said, they're not really driven by savings compared to normal bunker oil. I don't know, Chris, if you have any other angles to this.
Oh, I could talk about environmental investments for hours and hours, but suffice it to say, to come to your point, Timmy, yeah, the first thing is you've got to know the data. You've got to know what your carbon footprint looks like. Obviously, Flexport have got tools to help you with that. And once you've got that starting point, then you can go and look at how much you're going to need to spend to go through this environmental transition. But I think that's probably a topic for another day.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, thank you both. And I think that concludes also today's webinar. So a copy of the slide deck and access to the recording will be emailed to everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us. And actually, I want to also highlight also the next slide about the freight market updates, which will be exactly, yeah, there it goes, on the 25th of October. By Ocean and Air colleagues will give a live update on the ocean and air freight market situation. So it will be a little bit more in-depth discussion than what we did today. They will give you the latest information about what is happening at origin, whether that's Asia or Europe, and what we can expect at destination ports, and what we think is going to happen with equipment and space. So you can sign up using the link on the top or in the chat. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us, and I wish you a very nice rest of the evening. Thank you.